Okay, thanks everybody for coming. My name is James Paxton, and I'm going to get us started here. I'd just like to introduce, in case any of you are in the wrong room today, we're going to be talking about how to conduct research under an exception from informed consent. So now's your chance to escape if this isn't what you came for. But we thank you so much for coming. I think this is an underexplored area that a lot of people aren't familiar with yet. If you're one of those people, I hope you speak up. We've got a nice, cozy little group here, and I know for a fact we have some experts on the subject in the audience, so your questions will get good answers. As I said before, my name is James Paxton from Wayne State University Department of Emergency Medicine, and here's my co-speaker.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jill Baren, and I'm a professor at the Perelman School of Medicine in Philadelphia.
So we'll be kind of trading off midway through the show, and so you'll be expecting that. We'll go ahead and get started. So as we said, we are both involved with EFIC studies in different ways. Myself, my primary current involvement is as the chairman of the IRB, Institutional Review Board at Wayne State. And of course, Dr. Baren has been involved in several of these type of studies herself. And so we thought it would be unique to give you different perspectives on the subject. And hopefully that will benefit all of you in the audience. So what we're going to talk about today are some of the reasons, first of all, for performing EFIC research, the reasons why you might choose this methodology over a different type of methodology for your research project, describe the advantages and disadvantages of this approach. Hopefully at the end of the lecture you will appreciate how EFIC studies differ from other forms of research that we do in emergency medicine. And you hopefully will get quite a few different pitfalls and pearls out of this should you decide to go ahead and pursue this methodology. Most importantly, I guess the end goal for you, I hope, is to be able to participate in meaningful research that will target oftentimes neglected ED populations of patients. So most relevant to the discussion on EFIC, starting off, is, I think, what is emergency care research? And how does it differ from, let's say, other research that's done on patients? Well, as it's defined, or has been defined in the literature, emergency care research would be the systematic examination of patient care that's expected to be continuously available to diverse populations presenting with undifferentiated symptoms of acute illness, injury, or acutely decompensated chronic illness. So acute or acutely decompensated chronic illness, and whose outcomes depend on a timely diagnosis and treatment. That's the most important part of that phrase, timely diagnosis and treatment. Common conditions would include cardiac arrest, major trauma, stroke, seizure, the type of thing where the patient is generally going to have an altered level of consciousness. The person's not able to give consent. And let me ask, now that we're getting started talking about consent and research, how many in the audience conduct research or are involved currently in research activities? That's awesome. So like almost everybody. And how many of you have been involved in an EFIC or a WIC trial, looking at exemption or waiver of informed consent? Good. So like I said, we've got some experts out there. All right? So this will be fun. The patients that we're interested in studying in these studies are people that really cannot, by definition, give us their full informed consent. Okay? And that's an important component of understanding what EFIC and WIC really are. So to give you some idea for those of us in the audience who aren't currently engaged in this type of research, what are the major stakes that we have to deal with in EFIC and WIC research? One of the largest considerations would be the principles that were laid out in the Belmont report, which was, well, I guess about 40 years ago. There was a very important document put out which essentially described some of the things that we feel as researchers have to be respected when doing research in human subjects. And the three principles that were most prominent in that document and which continue to be very important in research today are the three things that are listed below that. Respect for persons, which essentially deals with autonomy, the autonomy of an individual, their ability to determine their own path and determine what happens to them. And respecting the fact that some people may not have autonomy, and how do we manage that. Beneficence, which is the idea that we are going to secure the well-being of the subject. We're going to make sure that the risk is minimal and the benefit is maximal. So our first interest should be to do no harm and to help our subjects. And the third thing is justice, which really, when you boil it down, becomes fairness. Making sure that no one part of our population suffers an undue burden of the research or gains more benefit from the research than other parts of the population. So trying to distribute the benefit and the risk of the research evenly across different populations. So the common sense or the real world applications of those principles are what's listed at the bottom of the screen. Things such as informed consent. And we've touched on that already. I mentioned to you that this is something often not possible in emergency care research, and the reason that we do EFIC and WIC studies. The three components of informed consent are information, comprehension, and voluntariness. So what that means is not only do you have to provide the information to the subject or their legally authorized representative, but they also have to understand it. It's not enough to just give the information. They have to actually understand and comprehend the information. And their involvement in the research has to be voluntary. It can't be compelled or coerced. And that's a very important part as well. Also, we look at the risk-benefit assessment, which has a lot to do with beneficence, and selection of subjects must be considered as well. Are we selecting individuals who are likely to benefit from the research or unlikely? Are we picking on a certain group of the or subgroup of the population, or are the risks and benefits being distributed evenly? So the challenges that we face doing emergency care research, the number one challenge, of course, is the patient is incapacitated. We would like, in an ideal world and standard research operating procedures, to consent the subject before the research. And I can tell you from an IRB perspective, IRBs are pretty lenient when it comes to risk, as long as you explain the risk to the subject and they understand the risk, they get the information, they comprehend it, and it's voluntary. IRBs are pretty willing to let a subject expose themselves to quite a few different things, maybe even a greater than minimal amount of risk in the interests of research. But when a patient cannot provide consent for themselves, that becomes very important to consider that they really aren't able to consider the risks and benefits for themselves. So oftentimes we have what's called a legally authorized representative that we have to involve in the decision making. But that person may not be available within the window or the time frame that we have to do the study. And so now you're really not any better off than you are without a legally authorized representative if they show up late to the process. So one of the problems we have to deal with is how can we achieve respect for persons, which we've now established as an important component of doing this type of research, doing any research, when informed consent is in fact not feasible. This is where we get into the regulations that permit this type of research to occur. So there are two general categories of research, and we oftentimes, and in fact in this show, we've used the acronym EFIC to represent what you could probably more properly call EFIC and WIC. EFIC is, strictly speaking, the regulation which applies to those studies which fall under the purview of the FDA. And generally those will be device and drug studies. But waiver of informed consent studies can be performed that do not involve a drug or device, and those are not, truly speaking, called EFIC. But we've used this phrase. I think it's become part of the popular parley, and that's why I'm using it in the title of this talk. But you can apply the same concepts to both because they are harmonized across both of these rules. And so collectively they're actually referred to as the final rule. And so the principles behind the final rule apply whether you want to call it EFIC or WIC. It's the same idea, and that's why we're simplifying it by referring it to as the EFIC. Okay. So how does this get interpreted? You know, those of us who concern ourselves in the law, we understand that there are people called lawyers and judges who interpret the law, right? The law exists, but someone must interpret it. The same thing is true for research. And on a local scale, it's important to remember that the Institutional Review Board is, generally speaking, the people who interpret the law for most purposes. So when you work in an IRB, we realize very quickly that there are very different people in the IRB who have very different opinions on things. And so what you begin to realize as an investigator is that something that you think may be very easy to, let's say, get through the IRB, for some reason gets stuck in the IRB and doesn't make it through. And so it can be frustrating for investigators, but also for members of the IRB, to have, shall we say, disharmony between the way the IRB views a study and the way that the investigator views it. Nonetheless, it's important to remember that the IRB's only reason for being involved in this process is really to make sure that the study is sound from an ethical perspective, and that they're going to represent the interests of the subjects. All right? They're focused primarily on the rights of the participants, as the study may or may not intrude upon them. And they're trying to balance the need for research, which exists, with the right of those participants, the rights that you can potentially violate by doing that research. This is a very difficult job, and it requires a lot of things to be considered. So they want a very diverse membership on the Institutional Review Board that includes both researchers, people who have medical and scientific knowledge, but also people who are members of the community, for example, lawyers or bankers or other people who have maybe no medical knowledge, but they have a knowledge of society. They have a knowledge of what is considered acceptable by ethical and moral standards. So all those inputs are important when determining whether something is acceptable to the IRB. Under the common rule, the IRBs can actually alter the informed consent process, which normally requires all the things I just mentioned, right? That you have a discussion with the subject, that they understand the material, that they're volunteering to be involved in the research. That's normally how you do it. But IRBs have the ability to modify those requirements, and that is done on a case-by-case basis and permitted under the regulations that are called the common rule. Three things that are commonly, or categories that are commonly used to describe these types of alterations would be a waiver of the requirement to obtain informed consent, or an alteration of some of the elements of the informed consent, or potentially also a waiver of the requirement to document informed consent. And there may be circumstances that would require one or more of these alterations to occur. But the IRB's job is to decide when those changes are necessary and to authorize them. Now, in order to qualify for EFIC, to do an EFIC study, you might be asking yourself, okay, so I've decided that this is a great idea. What I want to study is a category of research that requires this methodology, or I think requires this methodology, in order to get to actually do it properly. And now I've decided that I want to do EFIC, but I want to make sure that the IRB is likely to approve it, and that this is something that truly requires EFIC. Well, you want to consider the following: that the research must involve no more than minimal risk to the subjects. No IRB is going to authorize a study to be done that is highly risky without obtaining advanced consent, or consent in advance. That's just because that's their job, to protect subjects. It's going to have to involve no more than minimal risk to subjects. And also importantly, the IRB must determine that the research could not be carried out without this waiver or alteration. So just because you've asked as the investigator to do this, to use this methodology, doesn't mean that the IRB is guaranteed to approve it. They must determine on their own, by review of the information, that this is an appropriate methodology for your study. Also, they must ensure that the waiver or alteration will not adversely affect the rights of the subjects, and I mentioned that's their primary purpose. And where appropriate, subjects should be provided with additional information about their participation. That's an important component of your proposal that you're going to put forward. So this is probably one of the more common misconceptions about EFIC and WIC, the idea that, well, it's called an exception from informed consent or a waiver of informed consent. I don't have to get consent, right? No, that's not at all what it means. What it means is that to enroll the subject, you don't require consent in many cases. It doesn't mean that you never have to get consent. It doesn't mean you don't have to try to get consent. It means you have to try, but if you fail, you may still use the data in general. But again, IRBs can be very selective, and they can tailor their alteration of the policy to fit exactly what you require and no more. Okay? So they may require you to obtain consent or to attempt to obtain consent later on in the hospital course, either from the subject or their LAR. That's completely legitimate and most likely going to happen. So what are the indications? Well, I mentioned earlier some of the conditions that are characteristically studied using the EFIC technique. They're generally going to be life-threatening conditions, generally things that available treatments are unproven or unsatisfactory, where research is really truly needed. And this is more of a technical or a scientific question, and sometimes the IRB doesn't have a good perspective on that. Sometimes they need to bring a consultant in to tell them that this is really something that's needed. And importantly, that informed consent is really truly not feasible within the window that they want to study the subject. And it must carry the prospect of direct benefit to subjects. It doesn't necessarily have to guarantee that benefit to subjects, but it must carry the prospect of benefit. So in addition to these requirements, I know it's starting to sound like a lot of stuff to do, and it is, but it's important that it's done. There are some additional human subject protections that must be followed. And these are the things that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today, because they really truly separate EFIC and WIC studies from other types of EM research. Community consultation is a big component, and Dr. Baren will be talking a great deal about that. Public disclosure before and after the trial, which is what you and I in the audience, watching the news, reading the paper, are going to hear the most about. Independent data monitoring committee, that's generally going to be set up by the sponsor of the study and is generally required for most of these studies, if not all. There will be a process to contact and obtain informed consent from the LAR or the subject as feasible. And there must be an opportunity established to object to the procedures involved, that potential subjects must have an opportunity to evaluate the study and determine that they would not like to be included or enrolled. Now, what's challenging and also extremely exciting about this type of research is that it has been officially stated in the guidance documents that there is no single acceptable way to accomplish or fulfill community consultation requirements. And as a person who is working to design actually a WIC, but a waiver of informed consent study, I can tell you it gets pretty complicated trying to figure out what it is your community is going to want to hear from you or to see that you do to obtain community consultation. Certain studies will require more vigorous or more in-depth community consultation than others. So the options you have are going to be tailored to the type of project that you're going to do. You might do, for example, in-depth qualitative methods, which could be focus groups. Perhaps there's open public forums involved, or surveys, interviews, really truly endless list perhaps of things that you could do to get the opinion of your community on your study. And generally speaking, when you are defining who is the community that you're going out to reach, you must first decide, well, what do I mean by community, right? So some of us, perhaps if we work at a regional center, we might say, well, my community, and I live in Detroit, so my community is going to be Detroit. Or my community is going to be the area within 10 miles of my hospital. Or my community is going to be patients who suffer from epilepsy or sickle cell disease. Whatever it is that you need to study, whatever the subject group that you're studying, or whatever the geographic region, you have to define that not only for the IRB, but for yourself. Who are you going to try to reach out to? Maybe it's a geographical group, or maybe it's people who have a certain characteristic, certain age group, or certain predisposition. But importantly, consultation of the community is really not, it's not recruitment of subjects. You're not going out there trying to campaign and sell this study to your community. That's not what you're doing. You're not gaining their consent. This is not about getting permission to do something to someone. It is very much about getting the feedback from the community, letting them understand what you want to do, and then asking them questions and learning from them. It's very much a process of give and take between the investigator and the community, so that you can get a better appreciation for things that you might not even realize are important factors in, first of all, creating, but secondarily implementing your protocol. And it's a little different in emergency medicine, isn't it? So what is my community might be different for us than it is for other docs. If we work in, let's say, a benign hemonc clinic, maybe I would be looking at sickle cell patients. If I worked in a cardiac clinic, maybe I'd be looking at patients likely to suffer out of hospital cardiac arrest. But in the emergency room, how do you find patients that are likely to come to your clinic? Well, it could be anybody, right? Anyone can have one of these life-threatening conditions. So maybe there are people that are more likely to suffer these conditions, but realistically, you could, depending on your interpretation, go to virtually any community, any group of people. It will be equally appropriate for many of the conditions that we study. There are certainly some exceptions and some specific groups you would look at, and Dr. Baren will mention some of those as well. So important, though, regardless of the specific way that you choose to define your community, it must provide opportunity for discussion and dialogue with the community. You've got to engage them and get their opinion on things. You have to ensure that the community involved in the research actually participates in the consultation process. You showing up to the event is not enough. It has to result in some meaningful exchange of information. And you must make sure that they understand it. I think it's common sometimes for physicians or healthcare providers to put things on a level language that's really not comprehensible to the average person. So getting up in front of a group of people at a local church and giving the same talk I would give at Grand Rounds to a bunch of emergency residents is not appropriate, right? They're not going to understand the content, most of them. And it's appropriate that they need to understand it. So I need to make sure that my language and my way of communicating is appropriate for the audience. And then I have to solicit their input. They have to give me their comments and their feedback. I have to listen to them, and then they have to do what's probably even more important, and that is actually use the information, okay, and put it into my protocol and make changes to my study that are going to deal with or accommodate those requests from the community. I think that's an important part. So when you're presenting information, so now you've decided you're going to do EFIC or WIC study, and you've decided I'm going to go to this place, whether it be a church or community center or hospital or wherever you're going to go, and you're going to deliver information about your study. How will you present the information? And so one approach, which seems to be successful, is to start with general concepts, big picture stuff when you're talking to the community, and explain to them what is research. I think most of us in the room that would be an assumption you would make, that everyone in the room understands what research is. What is clinical research? Why do we do it? Why do we need it? You have to sell them on that first, right? Otherwise, anything you put on top of that is not going to be valuable to them. It's not going to be understandable to them or comprehensible. Once you've established certain concepts, like what is opt-in, what is opt-out, what is randomization, what is the clinical design, why does that matter, right? What's a double dummy blind study? These terms, patients and community members do not understand. So you have to make sure they understand before you can build on those. Once you've established general principles, now you're going to be talking about what is EFIC, what is WIC. How does this separate out from other types of research that's done? And then finally, once they understand all of that, now you get to talk about your study. Because without those pieces of the puzzle, they're never going to comprehend the importance of what you're trying to do. So you've got to lead them from basically an assumption of no understanding to an understanding of your study, which is a big challenge, especially if you're trying to do it in like 20 minutes. All right? So ideally, when they leave the room and you leave the room, what you've imparted to that group is an understanding of the trial, the challenges that you're going to face, and the importance of the study. They need to come to the conclusion, hopefully, that what you're going to do is important and needed. But how much of this consultation is required? What do I really need to do? Can I go to 2 places and I'm done, and I can go to the IRB and tell them I talked to 50 people and they said it was fine and they had these following comments? Well, probably not, right? Depending on the study involved, the IRB will establish what they think is a minimum necessary consultation. Budgets and time are important considerations, right? Me taking time out or having someone else take time out to go present something at a community center or 10 different events, that takes resources. And if this is a research study, there's going to have to be a budget for these items unless you're going to do it all in your free time as a charitable cause. So there has to be some money there and there has to be some time to do it. Planned events can be canceled, rescheduled, things can be shuffled, so there's a lot of considerations with that. And it's hard sometimes to get noticed. I mean, think about it. We live in an age of information overload, and you're trying to do the right thing by making the community aware of your study. You're putting things out, you're maybe shooting out emails, websites, Facebook, Twitter, everything, and are you is your message just disappearing in the midst of all of these things? You've got to try to find ways to ensure that the people you're trying to reach are actually going to not only receive the message, but process the message and understand it. And I think that's an important part of your plan. So public disclosure is important. And how are you going to do this? Well, before you start the study, you're going to provide information to the community so that they understand the risks and benefits involved. The fact that the study is going to be conducted without obtaining advanced informed consent. That's important, right? That's the whole point of this. And sometimes people, their gut reaction is going to be, no, that's terrible, you can't do that. Now you have to explain why this is necessary, that this type of research is necessary. You'll talk about opt-out mechanisms. Is there a bracelet? Can they sign up for a list where they don't have to be involved in the research? Maybe there'll be mailings or advertisements. And then again, after the study ends, you have to go back out and distribute the information as well about what it is that you found in the study. And that could be in the form of a journal article, a news article, a community meeting, whatever you did, your IRB and you determine to be appropriate. As I mentioned before, waiver informed consent or EFIC does not mean there is no consent. It means it can be delayed and can potentially not be obtained, but that there must be an effort made in general. And so before enrollment, you must try to obtain informed consent from the LAR within the therapeutic window if it's feasible. That's the guidance that we have. But feasible is up to interpretation, right? And it depends a lot on the acuity of the injury, their presentation time, the time you have to provide the intervention, and so on. And a lot of considerations here. And also, if feasible, you must provide the LAR, and again, always presume to be the LAR, not the subject, because of their mental state in general, an opportunity to object to participation in the research. They have to have that chance to say no or object, if feasible. After the enrollment, consent is not required for continued participation, but the IRB has the prerogative and the ability to develop a form to be used for continuation in the study if that would be appropriate. So just because you may think it's not appropriate, the IRB can determine that they think it is appropriate given the circumstances and the likelihood of improvement in the patient's cognition or LAR showing up. So regulations require that the subject be provided with information at the earliest feasible opportunity, but there has to be a balance between providing that information to the LAR and respecting that person's right to grieve or that person's right to have their own space. So having research staff rushing into the room of a person whose wife just died may not be the most appropriate thing to do at that moment. And that has to be considered by not only the investigator but also the IRB. So you think about that. Okay? And then subjects should also be able to withdraw their enrollment if they choose to do so. And then finally, things that the community will pick up on that you may not have picked up on, the term glitch has been used to apply to those things. When you're out talking to the community, they're going to throw things out at you that you did not expect to hear. So for an example, if your study drug is looking at progesterone, which is generally known as a female sex hormone, you're going to give it to men. Some men would not want that. They would say, I don't want female hormones inserted into my body. What you might not have picked up on is the idea that the same study drug is dissolved in ethanol, which would be a concern for Muslims who do not like to consume alcohol and think it's inappropriate. Now you're injecting something into a person's body that they would not want, right? You may not have thought about that. So that may be something that, as an example, that you need to consider as well. But there can be lots of things like this that you don't get until you actually involve the community. Okay? So with that said, I'll turn it over to Dr. Baren to bring us home with some case studies. Thank you.
Thanks, James. I am curious to know how many of you got involved in the Siren Network, and maybe that's why you're in the room here today. Okay, and for those of you that just raised your hand, had you ever been involved in implementing or conducting a study that was foregoing prospective informed consent before? How many have been through the community consultation and public disclosure processes? Okay, just a few of you, and I assume the rest of you are fairly curious about how to get that done. Well, I think I kind of made a mark in this field by being the geek who researches research regulations. And I somehow got really interested in how do we get this information across and how do we implement and how do we operationalize these cumbersome and difficult and complicated federal regulations that sound like, just basically Chinese when I read them. And so that's what we're here to talk about today. I think James did a great job giving you the scaffolding and kind of the requirements that you have to go through and then really talking about and staging this idea of these special protections. But I'd like to walk you through some case examples of prior EFIC studies or EFIC studies in which I developed some methods in order to give you a sense of how you might also be creative in working on studies in the future and figuring out how to do community consultation and public disclosure. This really is an iterative process. I want to stress it's a lot about trying things, having them fail, and ultimately you will be able to achieve success. And success really means that you're communicating your strategy with the IRB and you're getting the kind of feedback and information that you need to convince the IRB that your study should be conducted under these regulations. So there is a whole host. By the way, I just want to say that SAEM was instrumental about 25 years ago at giving a lot of input into why these federal regulations and the final common rule should exist. There was a group of researchers that said, we need to study conditions like cardiac arrest and stroke, and therefore we need a rubric. We need a system that allows us to do this work without obtaining prospective informed consent. So I have quite a bit of pride in some of my mentors and people I interacted with in this society that helped drive the field forward. And I think it continues to this day in that manner, and given that we are often a clearinghouse for a lot of network research. So here's listed on this slide are some early EFIC studies, and you can kind of pick out the papers and read an annotated bibliography of all the different EFIC methods that were used in studies like this, and you will find that it was very much a trial and error process to get these trials to be conducted. Some of them fizzled out because it was too costly. Some of them were terminated, and we're going to talk about one of those in just a minute. and some of them were just deemed to ultimately never be able to go forward because they did not convince the IRB that they should be conducted under EFIC. So let's start with one of the early ones that's actually in the public domain. People talk about this trial a lot. How many of you have heard of the PolyHeme trial? It's sort of the first thing that comes out. The ethicists love to chomp their teeth into this trial, and they like to say, you know, boy, this is an example of why we shouldn't be doing this kind of research. And so I always like to kind of start with PolyHeme to show that maybe we just didn't set it up the right way, that maybe it had some scientific benefit to study, but perhaps we really didn't get at those ethical elements, that glitch detection, understanding whether or not this was acceptable in a community. So PolyHeme was a controversial clinical trial in which hundreds of people actually received an experimental blood substitute. Now, what was interesting is that the place that the PolyHeme trial was mainly conducted were in urban environments with a disproportionate number of minority citizens. In fact, 13 of 20 cities had a higher minority population than the national average. And in fact, minority subjects accounted for 15 out of every 16 people enrolled in one particular site in a Detroit hospital. So the minority community felt very much like they were treated like guinea pigs because the study was being conducted in this fashion. PolyHeme again used a blood substitute in the resuscitation of trauma patients with hemorrhagic shock. And the form of community consultation that the PolyHeme investigators chose to use was they basically recruited key members of high-volume trauma communities. And these were people that were identified by staff that worked in the hospitals that were thought to be community relations staff. And then they would convene these folks together, and they would bring the research team who served as the presenters. There was an IRB member present. The hospital public relations coordinator would come, the community relations coordinator, and then a number of other council members. And PolyHeme investigators thought they were doing a great job. If you look at just the sheer volume and numbers of activities they did public meetings. They had about 83 attendees. They went on a local talk radio program. They had only 5 callers that responded to that program, and they set up a 24-hour hotline to facilitate getting feedback on what they had proposed to do in the community, and they only had 16 callers. So even though they made a tremendous effort, there was very little traction and very little penetration into the community that really needed to speak up and say what they thought about this trial. In terms of public disclosure, they used flyers, in-house publications, newspapers, radio, public service announcements. You get the idea here that this trial costs money to do all these additional protections before the trial even got started. The community consultation process in PolyHeme consisted of 4, unfortunately, poorly attended information sessions. They held these in a variety of community locations, at a Rotary Club, a shopping mall. One was even at a baseball game. And really, retrospectively, this was judged to be an inadequate form of community consultation. And why I go over this example is because we learned from this how to build out a more appropriate form of community consultation in subsequent studies. And these are just examples of, you know, why it was felt to be inadequate. There was expression of concerns by private citizens around you know, the fact that the study got approved, but it appeared not to really address community concerns. And then there were some community events that they declined to host the PolyHeme investigators, and these were in 2 African-American churches. And so again, speaking to that concern about not really reaching the population that this study was meant, that was actually drawing from in terms of their enrollment. So the feedback. The community consultation process in PolyHeme did tell us of the general acknowledgement that the study was needed in the community. This was a topic area, obviously rapid insanguination from traumatic hemorrhage is an important thing to address. We need to have therapies. We need to learn how to treat it. But there was general skepticism about the risks, the motives, and the potential profit of, actually the sponsor of this study was a pharmaceutical company, and there was general skepticism about the motives of that company. And again, the African American community expressed how sensitive they were to shouldering a large proportion of the research burden. As you heard you know, James talk about those principles upon which the Belmont Report is based, distributive justice is one of them. Is there fairness in terms of conducting the study within a specific population that may or may not benefit in the long run? Much kind of, you know, raising concerns about the Tuskegee study. So the other pitfalls that the PolyHeme study brought up was that even after patients were randomized to receive either the blood substitute or real whole blood, even after 12 hours of study entry, the patient was admitted to the hospital when blood would be available, they were still receiving the experimental therapy. And people definitely thought, especially the ethicists, that the study design was flawed in this fashion. There was also an inconsistency of IRB review across multiple sites in the PolyHeme study. Some IRBs found very serious concerns with the study design and with the community consult results, while others simply just kind of nodded and said, yeah, the study can go on with little or no recognition of some problematic areas. And then there were investigators at some sites that were not informed of adverse events that were reported by other sites. So a true learning experience of how not to do community consultation is written about extensively with regard to the PolyHeme trial. Okay, so fast forward, and now we have this great burst of network research activity in the specialty of emergency medicine. So research networks started to become a very cost-effective, large, kind of economy of scale way to answer important questions in emergency medicine research. So one of the first ones out there was the ROC network, the Resuscitation Outcomes Consortium, the PECARN network, Pediatric Emergency Care Applied Research Network, and then we also know that the NET and SIREN networks followed shortly thereafter. And these networks allowed us to really move the field forward and pave the way for investigator-initiated EFIC trials. So I'm going to share with you some of my personal experience of how to incorporate these special protections, these additional protections of community consultation and public disclosure, by giving you examples of how we did this in a couple of these different network trials. I'll talk about the PECARN pediatric seizure study, which was published in JAM, I think back in 2014, I want to say. The NET conducted Rampart. I'm sure many of you have heard of that, and the rapid anti-convulsant medication prior to arrival trial, which was a randomized trial of 2 different benzodiazepines to look at cessation of seizures and prevention of new seizures, and then the PROTECT trial, which was the progesterone treatment experimental clinical trial, which looked at progesterone versus placebo for moderate to severe traumatic brain injury. And there were a number of other out-of-network trials, which we're not going to have time to really talk about today. We're really just kind of getting at the tip of the iceberg, and then I want to have some time to make sure we answer your questions. So let me start off with the PECARN seizure study. As I said, it was an efficacy and safety study that compared lorazepam and diazepam for children in the ED with seizures. This was the very first federally funded multi-institutional research networks exclusively focused on pediatric emergency medicine, and the structure of PECARN, I think, is pretty well known. You can look at it on the website. I don't want to spend too much time focusing on that. But this study was a 2-part study funded by the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, and they focused on lorazepam being the highest priority drug to study because they wanted it to be labeled for this indication in children. Prior to the PECARN seizure study, the only one drug that was labeled for treatment of status epilepticus in children was actually diazepam. And there were some concerns about respiratory depression and cardiovascular depression with diazepam. So this was something that was high priority by the NIH. So the first study was pharmacokinetics, and then that moved into the second study, which was the randomized controlled trial. So we really spent a lot of time strategically thinking about how we were going to conduct this trial. And we knew, the investigator group, in our hearts, that the right way to do this trial was to operate under the EFIC regulations. But we also knew that we had some strong opposition. When you think about doing a study without prospective informed consent in adults, that's one kind of level of concern. But then you think about doing that in the pediatric population, and that raises a level of concern even further. So we got together and we formed an interesting structure for our trials, and I hope that some of you will consider this as you engage in your own type of research in these issues. And that is to have a dual structure of having a scientific PI and a human subjects PI, both of whom can focus, or each of whom can focus on their own special set of areas in order to get the trial to kind of run seamlessly using the EFIC mechanism. So that's what we did. And we started by going first to our regulatory partners at the NIH, and we put on a national panel for them called Emergency Research in Children, Ethical, Regulatory, and Clinical Challenges. And there we just shared with them why we thought this trial needed to be conducted under EFIC. And these were going to be the people that were going to determine our fate and decide whether or not they were going to fund the trial. and we were going to need to engage them and get their buy-in in order to do it under EFIC. That turned out to be a really important strategic move because once we had their buy-in, we were able to then go to our next level of regulatory approval at the IRB and be able to say, you know, our federal partners are interested in us doing the study this way. So we teed it up so that it was kind of almost a preordained conclusion that we could complete the study under EFIC. We were successful in getting all 12 of our original sites to have IRB approval. We then expanded the study to additional sites, and I think out of all of the full 18 that participated in this study, only one had an IRB that did not want to approve the study at that institution, and that was, they called basically administrative denial of the trial, and they elected not to participate. So we were able to go forward with IRB approval to operate under EFIC as opposed to doing the study with informed consent prospectively, as you might imagine. Talking to a family at the height of emotional dysregulation with a child seizing in front of them was not going to be our most optimal way to obtain informed consent. So patient enrollment was over a period of 4 years, and we enrolled over 300 patients. And prior to starting the trial, we had to define our community. We had to think about who we were going to consult with in order to feed that information back to our IRBs. And I want to talk with you a little bit about the challenges that we faced and how we set it up. So James already mentioned, how do you define community when you're talking about an emergency population? Well, one way to think about it is what's the catchment area around the hospital in which the study is going to be conducted? Would those be likely people to be brought to that particular hospital if they had the event that we were looking for? Well, the challenge with regard to that, and this may be true in some of your institutions, is that academic centers and regional centers typically serve not only a large geographic population, but they also serve a referral population. So you may have a helicopter service that brings patients in, or ground transport from further away. So it's really hard to define the community just as the catchment area around your hospital. Another way to define community is to look at individuals in that study that have particular social or medical characteristics that would be the likely enrollees. And this is how we chose to focus our community consultation in the PECARN seizure study. So we wanted to speak with families. We used administrative data to contact families who had had repeat visits to the emergency department with seizures. We got lists from our neurology clinic of patients that were diagnosed with epilepsy and who were regularly followed at the hospital. And then we reached out to them and developed smaller specialty focus groups and a set of surveys that allowed us to get right away to that specialty population that was affected by the disease. And that turned out to be a very important mechanism for community consultation because it provided the best information, the richest information that we needed from the people that were most affected by the topic that we were going to study. So this is just a summary. I won't get into all the detail. We did these focus groups. We trained a facilitator who developed a topic guide. We invited our IRB partners to come and listen to our focus groups. We provided representatives to answer technical questions. And we recorded and transcribed the focus groups so we could really learn what these families, and in one case we actually did teenagers with seizure disorders, so we could really learn about their thoughts about what would the study mean to them? What were their concerns about potential side effects of the medication? What was the general community awareness? And then would they agree to the type of opt-out procedures that we had proposed doing to conduct the study under EFIC? And it was really, I think, very rewarding to find out that at the end of this process, over 90% of the parents that were involved in these focus groups expressed willingness to enroll their child in the study if that study were conducted in their community. I'm not so sure that we would have been able to achieve such a high level of interest and engagement and desire to participate had we just done a community meeting, for example, or had we not really engaged with these people who were truly affected by the disease and taken the extra energy and effort to conduct this in such a smaller and more focused fashion. We also conducted surveys one-on-one with parents and patients in the neurology clinic where we had actual conversation about the study, and we had that very personal upfront and up-close discussion of the study, and that revealed some additional concerns in addition to what we heard from the focus group. So we were able to explain one-on-one with families that lorazepam was not FDA approved for children, and this was a surprise to many of the families that we discussed this with. And therefore, we were able to get much more agreement that medical research and so-called experiments in emergency care are actually important to advance the treatment of their child's disease. And so therefore, we were able, again, to obtain pretty high rates, 65%, in general, that these folks thought that emergency research without consent was acceptable within their community. So important lessons learned from kind of approaching community consultation in this fashion. Number one, it was not a random process. It took a lot of thought and time and a lot of strategy. We learned that the IRB, and maybe James can comment more about this, was they were not more educated about the Code of Federal Regulations and the Final Common Rule than the study team was. And in fact, we taught them a lot about what these regulations are like. And you all as potential investigators may need to take that very hands-on approach with your IRBs in order to help walk them through the process of getting EFIC approved for a particular study. We corrected a lot of misconceptions about the regulations that exist. We definitely did not take a one-size-fits-all approach. We allowed our individualized sites to come up with approaches that they thought would work best in their particular communities, and we focused a lot on what local customs and practices were. There was one site in our PECARN seizure study that actually had a particular ethnic group population, and there were some concerns that rose out of practices or who they respected as their elders and decision makers, and we were able to incorporate that in learning from our focus group methodology. And again, really looking for flexibility to make sure that our materials, our study and educational materials, got the right message across. We were willing to pilot those. We were willing to make changes based on that community input and glitch detection that we obtained. So I wanted to share with you some interesting data from a little sub-study that we had embedded into the PECARN seizure study. So originally when we met with our federal partners, they wanted us to conduct the study by obtaining what was called pre-consent. And this was kind of, in our minds, a crazy idea to go out and obtain pre-consent for possible participation in our study from literally thousands and thousands of seizure patients in our catchment area. But just to humor them, we did a little study to see if this was feasible. So we, and you know, this is sort of like a needle in the haystack phenomenon, right? So you go to a neurology clinic day after day after day, and you meet patients with epilepsy, and you pre-consent them in the possibility that they might show up in your emergency department with an episode of status epilepticus. No one has a crystal ball. No one could possibly know how to do that. So what we did was we actually pre-consented over 1,000 patients. We screened them, and we basically figured out this was the number of people that were eligible. This is the column on the right side of the slide. We approached 650 of them, and 102 of them gave us consent for that, and only 10 of them ended up being enrolled across our entire network. So you can see all the way from 1,330 down to 10, what an incredible effort that was with very low yield. In comparison, we used the standard informed consent process in the emergency department through the PECARN seizure study. We got a much higher yield and ended up with 37 patients enrolled. And we did a little cost analysis to see what it cost to have research assistants focus on the pre-consent mechanism versus the standard informed consent mechanism. And we figured out that of those 10 patients that were in the pre-consent group, it was roughly about a $1,200 cost per patient to get one of them enrolled in the study that way, compared to $186 factoring in all the indirect costs and all the research time compared to the standard informed consent using the EFIC mechanism. So we were able to really show that this was a way to control costs in a very costly study. All right, so conclusions. EFIC is an essential methodology for emergency care research. It allows us to study subjects that could not otherwise be studied in prospective trials because of the lack of capacity to provide consent. However, there are lots and lots of pitfalls that you have to watch out for. EFIC is very doable, but it requires patience, perseverance, and a positive attitude. I would not recommend that anybody enter into a study with EFIC thinking that it's going to be less than about a 5 to 7 year turnaround time. So perhaps some of you are residents or fellows or junior faculty. The best advice that I have if you want to engage in this kind of work is get involved in the network. get involved with people who have done it before, partner up with maybe mid-career or senior faculty who can mentor you through the process, because there will be some dynamic challenges with the IRB, with even the logistical challenges of setting these kinds of trials up in your emergency department with nurses, with other personnel, with your practicing colleagues, the communication process, and again, that dialogue with your funders, your sponsors, all really, really difficult to do either as a trainee or a junior faculty member. So it's absolutely doable, but I recommend doing it within a pre-established structure so that you can get a lot of support and a lot of advice and a lot of help. So with that, we want to hear from you. We want to hear what maybe some of your challenges have been. Have you tried to do an EFIC trial and been unsuccessful? What are you looking for in terms of guidance from us? I know there's some of you in the audience that have participated. I could call out a couple of you that have been part of my own network, and we'd love to hear, what your thoughts are further on the topic, and we thank you very much for your attention.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you so much. This was really informative. A couple things you said really resonated, that you ended up instructing the IRB more on the regulations. They weren't necessarily experts. In your experience and opinion, ethic research or WIC research in the pre-hospital environment apply to perhaps conditions that aren't necessarily things like cardiac arrest or traumatic shock, but something like an asthma exacerbation, where by the nature of studying something, an intervention in the pre-hospital environment, you can't really get consent to riding in the back of an ambulance. What's been your experience selling that to the IRB and to funding agencies? Because it seems like you have to do a dance where you get the funding agency to buy in and the IRB, but you don't want to sell something to the NIH that would be DOA if you brought it to the IRB. So
Yeah. Let me try to unpack. There's multiple parts to your question, all of them extremely important. The first part I want to address is the condition that's being studied. And you heard in what James presented that it's quite interpretive. You have a set of regulations set forward that say this is what qualifies as research that you could do under waiver of informed consent or exception from informed consent. But a lot of that is in the eye of the beholder, right? Does one consider asthma to be always life-threatening? Could you not carry out the research practicably if you didn't do it that way without consent? Are treatments unproven or unsatisfactory that allows you to study a new test article or a new investigative drug? So that's the first set of questions that you have to answer before you can even get to the next level, which is somebody going to approve it after I do all the other special protections? So it's important to think about what you're studying first. What question are you asking? And is it truly going to satisfy those first basic set of requirements to be conducted without prospective informed consent? My experience has taught me that those kind of, I don't want to use the word borderline, but I can't think of really a better term, those kinds of conditions where patients still retain some capacity but could be physiologically deranged and maybe bordering on maybe not having full capacity, either by virtue of being hypoxic or hypotensive. You come up against that a lot in IRB discussions, and they tend to not want to entertain it. There's been a number of people that have tried with things like acute agitation and psychosis, and IRBs tend to shy away from that if they think that there is a modicum of capacity that the subject has. So that's the first question. Next, I think your question is, what about conducting it in an environment that isn't necessarily regulated by the hospital's IRB? And that is also challenging because some hospitals have programs that actually have jurisdiction over their pre-hospital providers. In those cases, it tends to be a little bit easier because the regulatory environment also has oversight for those providers. But if you're in a municipal system, for example, in a large city, you may have pre-hospital providers that work for the city, and then the IRB actually becomes one that's part of perhaps the health department or other configurations. I don't know, Rob, you've done a lot of work. I mean, have your pre-hospital agencies been regulated like that? Yeah. Right. So sometimes you get lucky and your university or your medical center IRB feels like they can have enough oversight that they will actually approve it, and they might work with like a letter from the mayor's office or something of that sort that says, we defer to this IRB because we know they have expertise in the scientific and ethical and regulatory elements of the study. But you don't always get lucky. In my example, I tried to implement Rampart within the municipal system in Philadelphia, and the Department of Health IRB there flatly denied the study. And they cited legal concerns, which isn't really something that IRBs should be deliberating over. They should be deliberating over risk, risk-benefit for the human subject, but they focused on the legal issues, and they just didn't want to discuss it. So that can be challenging in the pre-hospital environment to figure out who has regulatory oversight. And then, of course, when you get past that part, then you've got to think about logistically how you conduct the study. And there are some fabulous experts in this country who know how to do these things. Rob Silbergleit, Marianne Gashi-Hill. There are plenty of really terrific, Tom Ofterheide. I don't know, I'm probably not coming up with
Jill Baren.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say my expertise is mostly in the pre-hospital realm, but through the conduct of the Rampart study and also the ROC investigators, Cliff Calloway. There's many people who have done excellent work. Eileen Bolger out she's a trauma surgeon out at Oregon. You know, look at their papers and look at their methodology. And a lot of times people will be very receptive to you just kind of reaching out and saying, hey, I want to get involved in this. I want to do this. Can you include me? And it works.
Given the history of PolyHeme, experience and groundbreaking foundational work of PECARN, do you think IRBs are doing any better, or are they just not getting it?
Excellent question, and the answer is I do. I think the emergency medicine research community has moved this field forward like no other. I'm very proud of the work that my colleagues and I have done around raising awareness about this potential mechanism to answer really important questions. I think the trauma surgeons have jumped onto it. I think, we've seen this in other specialty groups, but I really believe the emergency medicine community, through the existence of funded networks, have really said, look, this is a viable mechanism. We've demonstrated we can do it. We can do it in multiple sites. We can do it pre-hospital. We can do it quicker, cheaper, better. It's an amazing feather in the cap of emergency medicine. So I do think IRBs are changing. There's still some holdouts, but I think it's rare for an academic center around the country for their IRB to never have heard of EFIC anymore. They may not have done one, but they've heard of it, and they tend to talk. And in their professional group associations, many IRBs will fall in line after they hear that a different one has a comfort level. Where we may get into a little bit less familiarity is when you go out to community sites, and they may cede authority to an academic IRB, but when you're trying to do work that really pushes into the community boundaries, that's where you meet, I think, some of the unawareness. But I think we have moved the field forward a lot.
Opportunity to object when feasible. I'm just wondering if either of you have sort of examples of how you operationalize the opportunity to object if family members are there and the LAR is not present?
I think that's a great question, and I think in the interest of time, I won't be able to give you a lot of explanation back. I think maybe we have another session coming up, but what I will say is this: it has to be tailored to the study. And it has a lot to do with the acuity of the condition and the expectation of interaction with the family. Like, for example, cardiac arrest, it's not uncommon. I don't see an LAR in the ED ever in some cases, and certainly not in any time frame that would make it feasible to give them information. So, on the other hand, if you were doing a study on asthma, it's pretty reasonable. You might have a family member there right at that moment that you could have a discussion. So the ability to object really depends on a lot of things, but mostly it depends on availability of the family member. And I would say that you'd work that into your protocol as far as what you expect to be possible based on your understanding of the condition and what you've seen in the ED. And then you'd have to find an IRB that's sympathetic with your explanation and your understanding of that too. And they'll have their own opinion on it as well. So I think the key to remember, and this is not just for this question in specific, but in general, remember that your IRB has its own fingerprint. and that your institution, your IRB, will have its own way of viewing things. And in many ways, you're tailoring your protocol and your approach to the IRB that you're addressing. And so that's why, as Dr. Baren mentioned, in some cases there have been a lot of variation in terms of local IRBs and how they interpreted and whether they approved or disapproved different protocols. So I hope that answers your question in terms of what we would do or how you would address this issue, but it is very vague, and so it is open for interpretation. But I think that's exactly the intent, is for it to be open to interpretation, so that they don't want to pre-specify how this should be conducted. They want the IRBs to evaluate the situation and make a determination based on the conditions.
One point, if I may add, one thing that opportunity to object is a full informed consent discussion. And that, we pondered that question a lot in the PECARN seizure study, because frankly, there are oftentimes parents that do come alongside their child in status epilepticus. And some of our investigator group were actually concerned that they wanted to have a conversation because they felt like, well, if they're standing right there, this is awkward. You know, how can I decide to enroll under EFIC and then 30 minutes later go back in the room and say, oh, by the way, you know, I need your consent to continue in the study. And so we had quite a bit of a debate around it. And I think where we fell out, the majority of the PIs in the study said, you know, it's really not legitimate to have that kind of conversation under such emotional duress. And so our collective wisdom told us that it was okay for that reason, and that's why we substituted, when we removed that autonomy, we substituted the community consultation process and explained why we weren't doing that, and heard back from them a dialogue that, yeah, I don't really want somebody to talk to me because I'm looking at my child, I'm looking if you can get the IV, I'm looking at how quickly you can stop the seizure. So they were wholly focused on the well-being and outcome of their child, and they actually really didn't want us to talk to them. But I agree, it's a highly contextualized discussion with your IRB.
One of the things that we've sort of, that controversy has come up quite a bit is whether, you know, to provide family members the opportunity to object, whether you contact them via telephone, right? Do you try to make that call or not? Or do you sort of, yeah, you're right. I mean, I guess there's a lot of...
Okay, so counter to what I told you for PECARN seizure study, in the PROTECT trial, we had a therapeutic window of about 2 hours. So there it was feasible to try and dig up an LAR and to try to contact a family member. We still were unsuccessful. I think in the majority of the cases we were unsuccessful in reaching family members or LARs. But it was a longer therapeutic window, so it was reasonable to build that into the study procedures.
But when you're calling, you're just doing opportunity to object, right? You're not...
That's right. You are not giving the full, as I said, the full informed consent discussion, right?
Well, thank you, everybody. I think we're
finished.
about to.
Thank you.
I think we're about to get kicked out.
Yeah.
Thanks. One last thing, though, I want to tell you guys, two things. One is that Dr. Baren has an extremely good podcast available on the SAM website, so type in Google SAM Research Learning Series, you'll get that. It's already there. And then the second thing is I wanted to let everyone know that ACEP, SAM are both working together on a project that's going to be collecting protocols dealing with EFIC and WIC studies. If any of you in the audience have your hands on a copy of the protocol or the community engagement protocol, we'd be happy to take a look at that, and please let us include you in our study. Just email me at james.paxton@wayne.edu, and we can give you more information. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. Sorry to run over.